The vast hall of Zarak's flagship pulsed with cold steel, and an ominous hum, the lights above flickering, as if to echo the chaos simmering just below the surface. Zarak towered before Hayes, his enormous figure dwarfing the human diplomat, who stood unflinching at the center of the room. Every warrior in the hall watched with bated breath, their weapons resting lightly in their hands, some with disdain, others with curiosity. Hayes' eyes remained locked on Zarak's face, the warlord's scared visage an expression of deep mockery. Beneath the glinting armor that covered his body, he moved forward slowly, his voice like thunder rolling through the chamber. "How dare you stand before me, human? Did you think your petty words could sway me? Did you think you could bend me to your will?" The arrogance in Zarak's voice was palpable, but Hayes did not flinch. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, as if he had already won the moment. Zarak finished speaking. Hayes stepped forward calmly, not even a hint of fear or hesitation in his movement. "You think yourself a god among lesser beings," Hayes said, his voice steady yet carrying the weight of the entire galaxy behind it. "You conquer and destroy, you burn worlds with no thought to the lives you extinguish, and yet you are nothing more than a bully who hides behind an army." Zarak's jaw tightened, his nostrils flared at the insult, but Hayes continued, not waiting for a response. "What I offer you is not defeat, but a challenge." The warlord's eyes narrowed, the tension in the room shifted. "What do you propose?" Hayes raised his hand and gestured around the massive hall, the walls echoing his voice. "You are strong, Zarak. No one denies that, but strength alone is nothing without wisdom and understanding. You want to know how to stop your conquest. Do you want to know how to face your enemies and leave them trembling, not before your armies, but before your mind?" Zarak blinked, confused, momentarily taken aback at this human's audacity. Hayes took another step forward. "You are a slave to your own rage and pride," Hayes said coldly, not realizing it. "But your greatest weapon is also your greatest weakness." Zarak's grip tightened on the armrests of his throne, his knuckles turning white. "You insult me, human," he growled. Hayes shook his head. "No, I offer you something far greater than insult. I offer you a duel." Zarak's gaze flickered this time, his voice lower. "What kind of duel would a human like you propose?" he asked. The hall fell completely silent, every eye now on Hayes, whose words had taken a sharp edge. "A duel of minds," Hayes said calmly, "not bloodshed or violence, but intellect and strategy, a battle of wit, not weapons." Zarak let out a low chuckle, and his warriors joined in at the absurdity of the proposition. "How quaint," Zarak muttered mockingly. But Hayes did not falter. "You fear it, don't you?" Hayes said. "Your greatest strength is your cruelty, but cruelty will only win you battles. It will never win you the future." Zarak stared at him silently for a moment, the arrogance shifting into something like uncertainty. Hayes pressed on. "When you are the last of your kind, surrounded by enemies who no longer fear you, you will wish you had a weapon sharper than your blade. You will wish for something deeper, something that cannot be shattered by a single strike. I challenge you to a duel of minds." Zarak stood motionless for a long time, and then he laughed, a booming sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the flagship. "So you believe your pathetic diplomacy can match me in battle? You believe your fragile mind can outwit a warlord whose very name makes the universe tremble?" Hayes stood his ground. "Your name is known, Zarak, but it is not feared, it is hated. And that hate will be your undoing. A true leader earns respect, not through fear, but through understanding. Do you accept my challenge?" Zarak looked around at his warriors, who now shifted uncomfortably at the tension in the air. He could feel their eyes on him, questioning his every move for the first time in years. Zarak felt something unfamiliar stir in him. This was not a battle he had ever fought, and the thought of losing it filled him with an unease he had not known before. His hand tightened into a fist. He turned to face Hayes, fully, his gaze dark and dangerous. "You will regret this, human," Zarak said, "but the challenge is accepted. The galaxy will watch and see who stands victorious. After all this time, you or me." Hayes nodded silently, knowing full well this would be the greatest test of his life. The tension in the hall thickened like a heavy fog as the warlord's words hung in the air. Zarak's gaze never left Hayes, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts as he processed the human's audacious challenge. Never before had anyone dared to question his strength like this, but Hayes had done more than question it. He had humiliated him in front of his warriors. Zarak's pride was the foundation of his power. It had carried him through countless battles and countless victories. but now it felt like it was being chipped away piece by piece. He could feel the weight of his own arrogance, as if it were a burden that he had no choice but to carry, no matter how heavy. Zarak turned his back on Hayes, his hand motioning for his council to step forward. They would prepare for the coming duel. Hayes didn't flinch. His eyes followed the warlord's every move, watching as Zarak's trusted officers began to whisper amongst themselves, preparing strategies and contingencies for a contest of intellect, something so foreign to them. They were warriors, not diplomats. They knew nothing of negotiation, nothing of words, only of bloodshed and dominations. Zarak's pride demanded victory in any form, but a battle of minds was something else entirely. Zarak would need to bend to it or risk losing everything he had built. A sudden realization struck him like a punch to the gut. Perhaps this duel was more than a test of Hayes' skill. Perhaps it was a test of his own mind, his own ability to think beyond the simple violence that had brought him this far. The warlord ground his teeth together, his mind racing. Hayes would regret this challenge. He would make the human regret every word that had passed his lips. But even as Zarak thought this, a tiny part of him began to wonder what would happen if he lost. Would he truly be defeated by a mere human? Was that even possible? The thought gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. Zarak turned back to Hayes, finally, his voice cold and filled with venom. Your challenge will be your undoing, human. You cannot best me in any way. You think you can outthink me. You believe your fragile mind can match the might of my empire. I will break you with your own words. Hayes stood still, unwavering. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation, only a deep resolve. The human spoke slowly and with deliberate intent. You already have broken me, Zarak, Hayes said, but you have never seen it. You have never understood the cost of your victories. Zarak's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The warlord had always relied on his power and the fear he instilled in others to control them, to keep them in line. But now Hayes was telling him something different, something unsettling. What cost do you speak of? Zarak growled, his voice rising in anger. Hayes' response was calm. I speak of the cost of your empire, the lives you've destroyed to build it. Zarak's jaw tightened at the words. But Hayes continued, your empire is built on a foundation of fear, not loyalty. Every world you conquer falls because they fear you, not because they respect you. Respect cannot be taken by force. Respect must be earned. Zarak's mind reeled, the words cutting deeper than any blade ever could. Hayes had spoken truths that the warlord had long buried beneath layers of pride and strength. Zarak had always thought himself unstoppable, but now he was being forced to face a reality he had spent decades ignoring. The warlord's hand clenched into a fist, his claws digging into the armrest of his throne. If I lose this duel, I will lose everything, the warlord thought. But there was a strange new feeling emerging inside him. It was like a crack in the armor he had built around himself, a crack that had never been there before. For the first time, Zarak wasn't sure he could win this battle. Hayes stood there patiently, waiting for the warlord to respond, but the silence stretched on longer than either of them had anticipated. Zarak could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The idea of losing this duel terrified him more than any battle had ever done. He had fought entire fleets and torn apart planets, but a war of words against a human diplomat was something else entirely. What if he lost? What if his entire empire crumbled? Not because he was defeated in battle, but because he had failed to see the strength of this human's mind. The warlord looked down at his hands, his claws slowly unclenching as he tried to focus his thoughts. This was more than just a duel. It was a challenge to everything he believed about himself. Zarak's gaze returned to Hayes, and for the first time, the warlord hesitated before speaking. Do you truly believe you can outwit me, human? Zarak asked, his voice quieter than before. Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, he simply nodded as though the answer were already known. You've already lost, Zarak, Hayes said calmly, and this time the warlord knew the human was right. It was not his armies that would bring his downfall, it was his pride. The hum of the flagship's engines was the only sound that broke the thick silence that had fallen over the chamber. Zarak's warriors stood frozen, their eyes darting between their leader and the human diplomat, who had just made a statement so bold that it rippled through the room like an electric charge. Hayes was unshaken. He could feel the weight of the moment, the galaxy's fate hanging in the balance. It was not the kind of challenge he had expected when he was first selected as humanity's representative. But now there was no turning back. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined. This was not just a test of his negotiation skills. It was a test of his very belief in what humanity stood for. Zarak towered before him, his mind spinning with thoughts of how to retaliate, how to crush the human's insolence. But Hayes remained calm, his posture straight, his face unwavering. Zarak's pride was on the line, and Hayes could see it. The Warlord was beginning to unravel. It was only a matter of time before that unraveling exposed everything that lay beneath the surface. Zarak turned sharply to his council. They had already begun whispering amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern, their usual confidence shaken by Hayes' words. Zarak felt his control slipping, and he hated that he had allowed a human to get under his skin. This was supposed to be an easy victory. This should have been another footnote in his long list of conquests. Yet here he was doubting himself for the first time in decades. The human's challenge had made him question something deep inside. The Warlord didn't understand it, but he could feel it gnawing at him. Hayes, you have already won, the Warlord thought as he looked back at the human diplomat. Hayes' expression remained unchanged. The human had given him no choice but to play this game of minds, and it was a game he had never played before, not like this. Zarak turned his attention back to Hayes, his voice low, but filled with a simmering rage. You will not outlast me in this challenge. Zarak said each word a threat, his gaze unwavering. Hayes simply raised an eyebrow and spoke softly. That remains to be seen. Zarak glared at him, but Hayes continued. You pride yourself on your strength, Zarak, your conquests, your victories. But I wonder if you understand what true strength is. Zarak's eyes narrowed in contempt. What are you talking about, human? Zarak growled. Hayes' gaze was steady. True strength, Zarak, is not measured in how many worlds you've crushed or how many battles you've won. True strength is measured in how well you can govern, how well you can understand the people under your rule, and how well you can ensure peace. Zarak's mouth opened in disbelief. What peace? Zarak spat. The galaxy is built on war and conquest. Peace is a lie. Hayes' smile was small but knowing. Peace is a choice, he said quietly, a choice that you and your kind have ignored for too long. Zarak seethed at the implications of Hayes' words. His mind raced, and in that moment a crack appeared in his armor. For the briefest of moments, he saw the reality of what Hayes was offering. Peace, not because it was weak, but because it was strong. Zarak's eyes darted to his council, who remained silent, the unease in their expressions palpable. They had never seen their leader lose his footing this way. Zarak's hand clenched into a fist. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, and yet here he was considering something that went against everything he had ever known. Hayes continued, his voice smooth, calm, and calculated. You call yourself a conqueror, Zarak, but a conqueror wins battles, a leader builds a future. What do you think your legacy will be when all that remains of your empire is dust? What will they remember you for? Zarak's jaw tightened, his hands shaking at the thought. His mind was starting to fracture. The questions kept coming, relentlessly tearing at his confidence. How could he answer such a challenge? How could he defend himself against a truth that seemed to hang in the air like a cloud? Zarak opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips. Hayes had trapped him not in a web of deceit or force, but in the purity of a question, one that demanded introspection. Zarak looked around at the warriors in the hall. They were watching him, waiting for his response. They knew him as a god of war, but now they were seeing him as something else, something less certain, less invincible. The Warlord's minds screamed for him to take control again, to lash out, to remind them all of his power. But something held him back. Hayes had shown him a path to something else, and that path terrified him, not because it was weak, but because it was something he had never considered before. Zarak turned away, his voice hoarse. "The duel is yours to win, human." Zarak said the words bitter on his tongue, but for the first time in a long time he realized Hayes was right. The silence in the hall was suffocating. Zarak stood rigid, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He had just admitted something he never thought he would have to admit, that the human had a point, that perhaps the empire he had built on fear and destruction was not the unshakable force he had always believed it to be. The idea gnawed at him, but he refused to let it show. His warriors were still watching. They were waiting for him to regain control. They expected him to crush the human diplomat with the power of his will, but Hayes had already shifted the ground beneath Zarak's feet, and now the warlord was unsure how to stand, even as his pride screamed for dominance. Zarak's gaze flicked to his warriors, who stood motionless, their faces filled with confusion and doubt. Hayes had planted a seed, and the warlord could feel it growing inside him, like a virus spreading through his thoughts. He had spent so long thinking of his strength as an unassailable fortress. Now it felt like a fragile structure built on sand. "Hayes, you've already won," the warlord thought, and the realization of that truth was a cold dagger in his heart. Hayes was watching him now, no longer with the arrogance he had shown at first, but with a quiet patience that seemed to amplify the pressure. Zarak could feel his breath quickening, his grip tightening on the throne's armrests, his mind scrambling for a way to take back control, to reassert his authority. But Hayes wasn't trying to take anything from him. Hayes was merely asking questions that cut deeper than any weapon ever could. Zarak took a step forward, his voice shaking slightly. "You think you know me, human? You think you understand the empire I've built?" he growled. Hayes didn't flinch. He merely raised an eyebrow. "I understand enough, Zarak, to know that you have spent your entire life building an empire on fear and destruction. But I wonder what happens when the fear fades." Zarak's nostrils flared, the anger rising inside him. But even as it surged, he could not escape the quiet truth in Hayes' words. He could feel it now, like a crack in the foundation of his empire. "What happens when your enemies no longer fear you?" Hayes continued. "They no longer tremble at your approach. What happens when the weight of your cruelty becomes too much for even your own people to bear?" Zarak's mind screamed in defiance, but his voice came out lower than he intended. "Fear and cruelty are what have made me strong," Zarak hissed, but Hayes only smiled. "You call it strength, but all you have is a kingdom built on bones and ashes. What happens when you realize that those bones will eventually rise up against you?" Zarak's jaw clenched, but he couldn't bring himself to argue. The words lingered in his mind, twisting and turning inside him. The soldiers, the worlds, the countless civilizations he had conquered, they were all reduced to ashes. All of it now seemed meaningless in the face of Hayes' quiet challenge. The warlord's hand trembled for the first time in years, not with rage, but with doubt. Hayes' next words were simple, but they cut through Zarak's pride like a blade. "Zarak, do you fear your own people?" he asked. Zarak froze for a moment, the question hitting him harder than he cared to admit. "Fear is for the weak," Zarak growled, but the words lacked conviction. Hayes' eyes locked onto him. "Do you fear them?" Zarak didn't answer at first. The question hung in the air like a weight, but the truth began to sink in deeper than Zarak had ever expected. He feared nothing, and no one in battle. His strength was unparalleled. But this was something entirely different. This was a war of minds, and in this war Zarak realized that his greatest weapon, his strength, his will, had no place. This was something more insidious, more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. Hayes' steady gaze never wavered. The diplomat wasn't attacking him. He wasn't insulting him. He was only asking him to see what he had never allowed himself to see. Zarak stood frozen, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. Hayes' words continued to echo in his ears, a constant reminder of the doubt now settling like a weight on his chest. It had been so long since anyone had challenged him this way, and now that challenge had cracked his armor, forcing him to confront the very thing he had tried to bury for so long, the truth that his empire was built on fear and cruelty, not strength and respect, the truth that he had sacrificed everything for a legacy that might crumble beneath his feet. Hayes had struck a chord deep inside him, and for the first time in his life, Zarak was unsure of himself. He turned his gaze back to the human diplomat, whose calm eyes were fixed on him as if waiting for him to make his move. There was no arrogance in Hayes, now just an unwavering certainty that made Zarak's unease grow with each passing second. Zarak let out a sharp breath, his mind struggling to regain control. He had never been this vulnerable, not even in the heat of battle when his enemies stood before him with weapons drawn. But this was different. This was a war of ideas, and Zarak had never known how to fight that kind of war. He had always believed that power was absolute, that strength was the key to everything, that fear was the ultimate weapon. But now he was being forced to question that belief in front of his own warriors, in front of his entire empire. Zarak's gaze flickered to his council. They stood off to the side, their faces a mix of confusion and concern, their eyes darting between their warlord and the human diplomat. Zarak could feel their eyes on him, the pressure mounting as the seconds stretched into eternity. He could feel their faith in him beginning to waver, and that only fueled the growing anger inside him. He had been their leader, their god of war. For so long they couldn't afford to see him falter. They needed him to be unshakable, to be the force of nature. They had always believed him to be. Zarak clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms. He could feel the blood rising in his veins, the urge to crush Hayes, to show him once and for all that he was still the greatest force in the galaxy. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he hesitated. The doubt had settled too deeply into his soul to ignore it now. Zarak turned away sharply, his voice low and dangerous. "You have taken this too far, human," he said, his tone laced with venom. Hayes' expression remained unchanged. "This isn't about taking things too far, Zarak," he replied. "This is about the future of your empire, the future of your people." Zarak's eyes narrowed, his body tense. With barely restrained rage, "The future of my empire is mine to decide," he growled. Hayes didn't flinch. He merely nodded, and then spoke softly. "That's the problem, Zarak. You've spent so long deciding your empire's future for everyone else that you've forgotten to listen to what your people actually need." Zarak's breath hitched, the words landing like a punch to the gut. Hayes continued, "Your empire isn't just yours, Zarak. It's built on the lives of countless people, lives you've taken without thought, without regard for what they might have wanted, what they might have needed." Zarak's mind reeled, his heart thundering in his chest, his thoughts a blur. Hayes had struck a nerve that Zarak didn't even know existed, and now it was too late to ignore it. Hayes' voice was steady, unwavering. "You say your empire is strong because it is built on fear. But fear doesn't build strength. Fear builds walls that only keep people in prison." Zarak closed his eyes for a moment, the words resonating in a way he could not ignore. He had never thought of it like this. He had always believed that his strength came from the fear he instilled in others. But now the cracks in that belief were becoming impossible to ignore. The empire he had built was fragile, more fragile than he had ever dared to admit. He could feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He had destroyed worlds, he had slaughtered countless beings in the name of power and conquest. And now all of it felt hollow. Zarak's breath was slow and steady now. He opened his eyes to meet Hayes' gaze, and for the first time, he saw the human not as an opponent to be crushed, but as someone who had shown him something he had never seen before, something that terrified him more than any weapon could. Hayes didn't speak anymore. He simply waited, his gaze unyielding. He was no longer the arrogant diplomat challenging a warlord. He was simply a man presenting a truth, one that Zarak was now forced to face, and that truth tore at the very fabric of everything Zarak had known about himself. For the first time in his life, the warlord realized that true strength was not in domination, not in fear, but in understanding and wisdom, in the ability to build something lasting, something that could withstand the test of time. The weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. Zarak looked down at his hands, trembling slightly, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. His empire, his people, his legacy, they were all in jeopardy, and it was all because of a simple question, a question that had shattered everything he had worked for. And now there was no going back. Zarak raised his head, slowly meeting Hayes' eyes once more, and for the first time he did not see a threat or an enemy in those eyes. He saw something else, something that Zarak had not seen in years, something that made him feel smaller than he ever had before. Humility. Zarak stood there in the silence, feeling the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. The throne room felt smaller now. The walls closing in as his mind raced. The galaxy seemed so vast, so full of untapped potential, and yet all he had ever known was war, conquest, and fear. His grip tightened on the armrests of his throne, not out of anger, but out of frustration. The foundations of everything he had built were crumbling before his eyes, and for the first time in his life, Zarak was unsure of himself. His fear of losing control had always been his greatest weakness, but now his fear was different. It wasn't the fear of death or battle. It was the fear of losing the very thing that had defined him for so long, his identity, the Warlord, the Conqueror, the Master of the Galaxy. Those titles had been his armor for decades, but now they felt like chains, heavy and suffocating. Zarak's gaze shifted to Hayes, the human who had so easily cracked his armor and revealed the raw vulnerability beneath the surface. The diplomat stood still, waiting silently for Zarak to speak, waiting for him to make the next move. The challenge had been made, the stakes were clear, and now it was up to Zarak to decide what kind of leader he would be. The Warlord had always prided himself on his power, his strength, his ability to command and dominate. But now those qualities seemed like relics of a bygone era. His power had come at the cost of everything else, at the cost of empathy, at the cost of respect. Zarak's jaw clenched as he realized the truth. Hayes had forced him to see the empire he had built was not the glorious empire he had once believed it to be. It was fragile, it was hollow, and it was doomed to fall if he continued down the same path. The Warlord swallowed hard, his mind battling with the truth Hayes had laid before him. Every instinct in his body screamed to fight, to destroy, to prove his superiority. But now something inside him refused to let him take that path. A quiet voice inside him urged him to listen to something deeper, something that had been silenced for too long, the voice of reason, the voice of a leader, not a conqueror. Zarak turned away from Hayes, his eyes closing as he took a slow breath. He could feel his warriors' eyes on him. They were watching him, waiting for his next command. They expected him to lash out, to punish the human diplomat for daring to challenge him. But Zarak couldn't bring himself to do it, not anymore. His heart was heavy with the weight of the decision he had to make. The easy path was the one of destruction, the one that led to more bloodshed and more fear. The hard path, the one that led to understanding and growth, was the one that terrified him most. But it was the only one that offered a future worth fighting for. Zarak opened his eyes, his gaze steady as he turned back to Hayes. "You are right," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant. Hayes raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by the admission. Zarak continued, "This empire has been built on fear and cruelty, and I have been its architect. I have been blind to what it truly needs." But no more. The warriors in the room were silent, their eyes wide with shock. They had never seen their leader so vulnerable, so open to the possibility of change. Zarak's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of his council. They looked just as stunned as the warriors. The realization that their god of war was questioning everything was unsettling, but there was a quiet strength in Zarak's eyes, now something that had been missing for a long time. Hayes' words had shaken him to his core, but they had also opened something within him, a new understanding of what true leadership could be. The Warlord straightened his back, his shoulders squared with newfound resolve. He had always believed that strength was measured in how many worlds you could conquer, how many battles you could win, but now he understood that true strength came from knowing when to stop fighting, when to listen, and when to build something better, something lasting. Zarak looked back at Hayes, his eyes no longer filled with rage or disdain, but with something else, something almost like respect. It was a strange feeling, something he had never felt toward anyone who wasn't a warrior. But in that moment he realized that Hayes had done what no other had managed to do. He had broken through Zarak's pride and shown him the path to something greater. "You have shown me a way forward, human," Zarak said quietly, and for the first time in years he felt a sense of peace settle within him. It was a fragile peace, one that could be easily shattered, but it was a beginning. Zarak turned to his council. "We will rethink our strategy. We will open our minds to the possibility of peace. We will no longer rule through fear, but through understanding." The warriors looked at each other, uncertain, but Zarak's voice was firm and unyielding, his words final. Zarak had taken the first step on a path he never thought he would walk, and though the road ahead was uncertain, The warlord knew one thing for certain: it was a road worth traveling. The weight of Zarak's words hung heavy in the air. The room was filled with a stunned silence. His warriors, his council members, all stood frozen, as if unable to comprehend what their leader had just said. Zarak had always been a figure of invincibility, a god of war whose word was law, whose might could crush entire fleets with a single command. Yet here he stood vulnerable for the first time in his life, admitting that he had been wrong, admitting that his way had led them to the brink of ruin. The tension in the room was palpable as Zarak's gaze shifted from one face to another, searching for something, anything to reassure him that he had made the right choice. But all he saw were uncertain eyes flicking nervously between him and the human diplomat. Hayes stood still by the side, his expression calm, his eyes unwavering. Hayes knew the difficulty of this moment better than anyone else. This was not just a shift in strategy, it was a shift in ideology. It was a challenge to everything Zarak had ever known about himself. Zarak took a deep breath, steadying himself. His mind was still in turmoil, but the path was clear now. It was a path he would have to walk alone, for there was no turning back from this. Not anymore. He had taken the first step toward something new. But he knew that his warriors would not follow without hesitation. They would not simply accept his change of heart. They would need to be convinced. They would need to see the truth of his words for themselves. Zarak turned slowly to face his warriors. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of authority. "We will no longer conquer through fear," he said, each word deliberate, "and heavy fear has no place in this empire." The warriors exchanged uneasy glances. Zarak could feel their skepticism, their confusion. But he pushed forward, his voice growing firmer. "We will build a future based on understanding and unity, not bloodshed and domination. We will seek peace with those who oppose us, and work toward a future where our strength is not measured by the number of worlds we subjugate, but by the respect we earn from those who stand beside us." Zarak's words were met with silence, but it was a different kind of silence, a silence filled with doubt, not rage. Zarak knew the road ahead would be difficult, that not everyone would accept this change. But he also knew that this was the only way forward, and for the first time in his life, he felt the flicker of hope that had long been extinguished now rising within him. Hayes watched the warlord with quiet approval, but said nothing. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. The battle for Zarak's soul had been won, but the battle for the hearts and minds of his empire was just beginning. The following days were filled with tension. The galaxy buzzed with rumors of Zarak's sudden shift in policy. Word had spread fast that the warlord, who had once been the most feared in the galaxy, now sought peace and understanding with his enemies. The warlords of the other factions were furious. Their own leaders were skeptical, and many saw Zarak's decision as weakness, not strength. Whispers of rebellion began to spread among his own ranks. Some spoke in hushed tones about the fall of the mighty empire. Others saw this as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. Zarak felt the pressure mounting as old alliances began to fray and cracks began to show in the foundation of his empire. His council, though loyal, seemed wary, unsure of the path their leader had chosen. Zarak knew that his warriors were watching him every moment now. Their faith in him was no longer a given, it had to be earned again, and it was a task he knew would take time, patience, and strength. He could feel the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him heavier than ever before. Zarak spent hours in the war room poring over battle plans and diplomatic reports, his mind racing as he considered how to move forward, how to ensure the survival of his empire. And the vision he had set out to create peace was not an easy path to walk, especially for someone like him, someone who had been raised in a culture of dominance, where only the strongest survived. But Zarak was determined to see it through. He knew that change would not come easily, and that he would face opposition from all sides. But he also knew that there was no other choice if his empire was to survive and thrive. Zarak finally emerged from the war room, his eyes hard and determined. He summoned his warriors to the grand hall and stood before them, his once proud voice now filled with the quiet strength of conviction. "We are at a crossroads," Zarak began, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had once followed him blindly into battle. Now they looked at him with uncertainty, as though waiting for him to make a move one way or the other. "I have led you to this moment, and I will lead you forward," Zarak said. "The empire I have built was founded on fear and violence. But that must end today. We will no longer be defined by what we destroy, but by what we create." Zarak's words were met with silence. But in that silence, Zarak could sense the shifting tide. Some of his warriors were still unsure, others were listening intently, waiting to see if their leader truly meant what he had said. The storm was approaching, and Zarak knew that the future of his empire would be decided by the choices he made now, and that not all would be easy, not all would be forgiven. But there was no turning back now. Days turned into weeks as Zarak worked tirelessly to reshape his empire. The tension among his ranks didn't dissipate, but it did change. It became something different, not a sharp anger, but a simmering uncertainty. Some followed out of loyalty, others because they feared what would happen if they did not. But Zarak remained steadfast in his decision to change the course of his empire. His first act of diplomacy was not to secure another planet or enslave a new species. It was to send emissaries to the rival warlords of the galaxy, not to threaten, not to conquer, but to seek talks of peace. He had no illusions that they would easily agree to his terms. Many saw his peace talks as a sign of weakness, and they refused to meet him with anything but disdain. Some even laughed in his face. But Zarak did not waver. Each rejection brought him closer to the realization that his vision was not a simple one. It was a long and difficult path, one that would be fraught with challenges, but it was a path he knew he must walk. Zarak's empire began to change slowly at first, but the effects were undeniable. His people began to look at him differently. They began to see that the warlord who had once been a tyrant was now something else, something they had never expected, a true leader, a leader who sought something beyond the endless bloodshed and fear. Zarak had no illusions that all would be forgiven, that his past could be erased in an instant, but he believed in the possibility of redemption, in the possibility of change. He did not seek to forget the past, but to build a better future for those who lived under his rule. The galaxy watched as Zarak's empire began to shift. First, small alliances formed among his former enemies as they saw the sincerity in his actions. His diplomatic efforts were slow, but they were steady, and over time his reputation began to shift from that of a brutal warlord to that of a cautious and calculating leader who sought unity. Zarak knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The resistance within his own ranks was growing more vocal, and the rival warlords were preparing to strike at any moment. But Zarak remained focused. He understood now that true strength was not in crushing his enemies, but in bringing them together and creating a lasting peace that could endure beyond his reign. He turned his eyes toward the horizon of the galaxy, where the future awaited, uncertain but filled with hope, and for the first time in his life, Zarak felt the weight of his empire lift ever so slightly as he embraced the challenge of rebuilding it, not through fear, but through understanding, and the hope that one day his name would be remembered not for the destruction he had caused, but for the peace he had brought to a war-torn galaxy.